Welcome to Rebel History. I'm Alicia Kennedy.
And I'm Charlotte Everett. We're public historians dedicated to diving deep into the radical history of Britain and beyond.
From rebellious freedom fighters and working class heroes to forgotten stories that the history books don't want you to know about, we explore how change has been effected through the ages.
We are also the founders of Rebel Tours, where you can actually join us in person in London and Manchester to bring these stories to life.
Hello, Charlie.
Hey, Ellie.
It has been quite a week in the UK, so before we get started on today's episode, thought we'd just have a little bit of a debrief of what's been going on, right?
Yeah. And also to say that we're recording this episode the night before the King's speech. And even since the local election results, which we're only going to touch on really briefly, I suppose, in terms of our afterthoughts. There is chaos in Westminster today. And I think, last I looked, there were 85 MPs within the Labour Party who were calling for the Prime Minister to step down. So I'm not sure what this King's speech is going to look like tomorrow, but I kind of feel like he's going to have to just go and do it, isn't he?
And not only MPs calling for the PM to resign, but a number of ministers have also actually resigned themselves, including Jess Phillips.
Yes.
So, it's be interesting to see what the King has to say. But on the local elections, so just to give a sort of rundown of what happened, especially if people are not from the UK, a little explainer on what we were actually voting for. So there were 136 councils that had seats up for elections. Now, these are not elections for members of parliament, are they? These are elections for local councillors. So these are the local governments. We have a lot more. We've got 382 in the whole of the UK. So it was mostly the English councils. Well, in fact, it was just the councils in England where there were seats up for election. But at the same time, we had elections in the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Parliament as well. So there was a lot going on. In England, there were about 5,000 seats up for election, weren't there?
Roughly that.
So the kind of rhetoric is the big winners are sort of seen to be reform. They made a lot of gains. They took a lot of, I guess, historic Labour seats. They gained control of entire councils. The big losers were seen to be Labour. And what about the Greens? What did you make of them?
Yeah, so it's no secret that I am very much in favour of political reform, electoral reform, and proportional representation, because the Greens, the big race was supposed to be between Greens and Reform, right? It wasn't really between Labour and Conservative as it would have traditionally been. And I think everyone was expecting both of these parties to do very well in the local elections, but they were perhaps surprised that the Greens didn't do as well as anticipated. Now, the thing is that there can only be one winner, so to speak. And in areas where it was quite close between Reform and Green, if Reform had just slightly nosed ahead, that means that that the Greens wouldn't have gotten those votes, but the Greens have taken a lot of votes away from Labour perhaps, and so on. So if you were looking at the, I guess, percentage share of the vote in each council, I think you can see that the Greens were actually doing much better than the seats gained. I actually just wanted to share Caroline Lucas actually posted something on Blue Sky the other day, which is just an example, which
Caroline
is
Lucas, sorry, just for those that don't know, former leader of the Green Party.
Yeah. So she has said on Blue Sky that in Wigan, Reform won 96% of seats, on only 46% of the votes. So just to kind of make that very clear, Reform got 46% of the vote in Wigan, but they got 96% of the seats. In Westminster, the Conservatives won on a majority of 35%. Okay. 35%, and the Conservatives won Westminster. And while Green Party won 18% of those votes without gaining a single seat. So we can't let this happen in 2029. The time to change the voting system is now, because our
Mm.
voting system hasn't been working with two parties, and it's certainly not working with five parties.
Yeah, and just to kind of a little explainer on how the system works. So we have a system in the UK called first past the post. And first past the post means that if we've got a number of candidates, the person with the most amount of votes wins, but they don't necessarily have to have a majority. So it works like that in our local elections. So you could win the seat with a, say, 35% of the votes, which is not a majority. That means that a lot of people did not vote for you, instead of having a more proportional system where perhaps there's more a plurality. There might be more seats representing kind of the real vote share. They have started to do this in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland in different ways. But in England and in our British
Mm.
general elections, we have this first past the post system. So I actually had a little look at, just to give an example, I've chosen Calderdale because this is where I am at the moment. So it's just an example. There are two wards that have entirely, I think one of them elected all three councillors Green, the other one two out of the three. But the whole council is now controlled by Reform. So, if we would have had a proportional representation system, Reform still would have done pretty well in Calderdale, but they would probably have gotten about 40%. And that would have given them maybe 19 or 20 seats, as opposed to the 34 seats that they ended up getting. So, yeah, the system needs changing, but they still would have done pretty well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm from New Zealand originally. We got rid of first past the post in the 90s. I was too young to vote when we got rid of it, but I remember when that change came in. And we have a system called MMP, which is mixed member parliament. So it is coalition by design. And you get one vote for the party of your choice and one vote for a person of your choice within your local electorate or constituency, as we'd say here in the UK. And they can be different. And it's not a perfect system. I don't think there is actually a perfect system out there, but it's designed so that you do get what you vote for, in the respect that you'll get even a little bit of representation is how it should work. Now, again, even with MMP, it should be coalition by design, but we did have a Labour landslide under Jacinda Ardern's, government when she first came in. That actually they didn't need to form a coalition with the Greens or any other parties, but they chose to do so. But they
Mm.
actually managed to beat that system and break that system. And we've seen that as well historically in Scotland, where the SNP also managed to break the system. This was some time ago. But I think the reason I feel so passionately about this is I think it won't come as any surprise to anyone listening that here at Rebel History we are not reform supporters. We the other way. But the argument against electoral reform and political, proportional representation in the past has always been, if we have proportional representation, then people with extremist views, and you could say far right or far left, you could say whatever, people with extremist views are going to get representation. And I say, fair enough, because I strongly believe that if years ago people with these views had their representation, we wouldn't have the situation that we now have. Because even if they're just getting us, it doesn't really work with, first past the post. Nigel Farage gets in, years ago or whatever. He's still not going to show up to Parliament. He's still not going to do anything for his constituents. Doesn't really change anything. But if you have the system rigged so that it is proportional and MPs are held accountable. If people feel that they've got that representation, then they're less likely to take these extremist kind of reactions. It is how I feel about it. But the only way we can test that theory is if we do have electoral change, hopefully in the future.
Interesting, and engaging with people perhaps in a different way, because I'm seeing a lot of this kind of feeling from the left or from the Greens of, oh, don't worry, it's not as bad as it looks. And I say,
Mm,
let's not be complacent. It is pretty
yeah.
bad, and we don't need to make, the mistakes of America, for example. And we need to engage properly with what is going on with this shift
Mm,
to the far right. And I've spoken to, quite a few people who were very surprised, maybe more kind of further left leaning people who were pretty surprised at the results. I wasn't surprised at all.
no,
It's
neither
what
was
I
I.
fully
Not at all.
expected to happen.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's because some people are in a bit of a bubble, perhaps, especially if you live in London,
Mm,
you're perhaps in a
mm.
little bit of a bubble. But a lot of these votes, a lot of these councils were in the north, in very deprived areas.
I think, you make a really valid point about people living in a bubble. If you only interact with people who have the same views as yourself, then you're maybe not going to understand, that there's a lot of people out there who feel very differently. I myself have always tried to engage with people who have very different views from my own, even if that's really uncomfortable. And, really good example is, there was a guy out on the streets the other day, as you know, Ellie, it was on Instagram, I think it was, speaking to reform supporters and asking them what they thought of reform's policies. And it was very clear that a lot of people were voting for reform because they felt disenfranchised and they wanted to stop the boats. Okay. So it was like a single issue sort of thing. Because when they were saying, what do you think, for example, about an employer being able to fire someone and then rehire them on a much lower salary? And they're like, oh, that sounds horrible. Or what do you think of 0 hours contracts? Well, that's horrible. These are policies that Nigel Farage has, so people are not engaging not only with each other, but they're not actually engaging with what they're voting for.
Yeah, and on that point, I would recommend, there's a really great interview. At just I saw it today. It's Ash Sarkar interviewing Peter Mertens of the Workers' Party in Belgium, and he's making a lot of these same points. And it's very
Mm,
interesting to see how they do things and how they try and engage with the problem. And like he said, there's always going to be a tiny group of fascists that are beyond. You're not going to change their
yeah.
minds, but there's a lot of people that you can, and those are the people we need to engage with. I think the working class have very much been let down and betrayed by the labor movement.
Mm.
That's how
Well, no,
how
yeah,
I feel.
that's it's not helpful, to say that, these people are stupid or ignorant or whatever. People are feeling disenfranchised. People have lost hope, and we need to find a way to connect with them.
And on that, let's cheer ourselves up a bit, because we've got a really fascinating character to talk about today, who is a 17th century woman, Mary Frith. Oh, I love this character so much. She's also known as Cutpurse Moll. And she's
Mm,
depicted as a petty criminal, a cross-dressing tomboy, gender-bending hero, pipe-smoking performer. There's a lot of questions around her sexual orientation, but there's so much mythology around her character. A lot of that created in her time, some of it afterwards. it's very difficult to discern, fact from fiction with Moll or with Mary. So what we're going to try and do today is untangle as much of her story as we can, and that will take us into Jacobean London's crime scene, the flamboyant world of the theatre, and some ideas around gender identity. So all very exciting. Mary Frith then is probably born around 1585. We're not too sure. Her dad is a shoemaker from the Barbican area in London. Her mother is a housewife. So a lot of the accounts of her life come in the form of pamphlets made about her. There are a couple of biographies and even a play, which Charlie's going to tell us about. What they all have in common is that they're all written by men. They are all quite sensational. So these are things that we have to understand when we're trying to piece everything together. According to one of the pamphlets, already from a young age, she's dressing up in boys' clothes and she's showing a rejection of what women were expected to look like, how they would, how they were supposed to behave. She was described as Tom Rig and Hoyden. Have you ever heard those expressions before? Tom Rig.
I've heard Tom Rig. I definitely haven't heard Hoyden.
No, I hadn't heard Hoyden either. So essentially, they mean tomboy. I mean, Tom Rig, tomboy, but they were also used to describe a woman who was rude, wild, and sexually promiscuous. So a
Of course.
rig, yeah, a rig is a very promiscuous woman, essentially. So almost it's like they're saying if you're wild enough to dress like a boy and you have this rough manner about you, you're up for anything, basically, is the idea, right?
Yeah, exactly. And actually, Mary's father's brother, who was actually a minister, he even had a plan to reform her. So this uncle attempts to send her to New England, and we're talking peak Puritan territory here. In fact, the chief party pooper, Oliver Cromwell himself, had originally planned to move there, had his political fortunes not changed. And if you consider the kind of young person that Ellie has described Mary to be, she essentially epitomizes all of the sin and degeneracy of the old country's decline. But she can still be saved and sorted out in this new godly land, is the thought behind it. So her uncle packs her bags. He breathes a sigh of relief as she boards the ship. But Mole had other ideas, and she actually jumps ship before it even sets sail. And unsurprisingly, she refuses to see this uncle ever again.
Well, just what I like about that story is that it feels a bit far-fetched, and I just wonder,
Yeah.
do you think that is true, or do you think it kind of serves you sort of explained the sort of purpose that it serves there, the narrative of that. So with a lot of these stories, you do wonder which ones are
Mm.
true, have some grain of truth, or what purpose they served as well. Because that's a pretty fantastical but very cool story, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, from what I know of Mole, I know it seems far fetched, but I also wouldn't be entirely surprised. So it's one of those things where I think it's quite difficult to say because I think in general, anything involving the Puritans seems quite extreme and far fetched a lot of the time, right? So I
That
would
is
not at
true.
all
That is
be
true.
surprised, if she's got a puritanical uncle who wants to send her away to New England. And he manages to get her on the ship, and then she just decides, "Sod this, I'm gonna jump off." I mean, they haven't actually departed yet, so if he hasn't stuck around to ensure that she stays on there, but as you say, this is just one of many fantastical stories
Yeah.
about Mole.
And
It's
we'll
difficult
come
to
on to a
separate.
few others. So the nickname then, she's known as Cutpurse Moll. So a cutpurse is a thief, it's like a pickpocket, and she was actually arrested for that crime. So we do have record of this. She's arrested with two other women in 1600 and again in 1602. And from that entry though into the world of crime, that's when we end up with this mythologized image of, this boot stomping, pipe smoking rebel
Yeah.
who challenges those like established societal norms. It seems like she goes beyond cutting a few purses, though. She could have been arrested for burgling someone's house a little bit later, But by the 1620s, she was working as what's known as a fence. So this is someone who deals mostly in stolen goods. They don't steal the goods themselves, they will act as the middleman, also known as a receiver. They only receive the goods so they can say, "Oh, well, I wash my hands of this. I don't know they was stolen." So then they'll sell them as quickly as possible. Sometimes they'll try to hide evidence on them, disguise them so no one knows they're stolen. It was dodgy. It was technically illegal, but it was incredibly difficult to enforce the law for fencers. And Mary would even present herself as a broker, which, of course, a broker is a legal job. But even for brokers, there was a lot of gray area. By the time she's doing this, though, she is already a sort of celebrity. She's been arrested multiple times, not only for petty theft, but for her cross dressing. That was probably seen in an even more serious light than the theft. The theft maybe was even a consequence of this very unnatural behavior. The way she becomes a celebrity seems to be via this life of petty crime, but she's also going into lots of spaces where women were less visible and dressing in more masculine clothes. So she's drawing a lot of attention to herself. She's in ale houses, tobacco shops, taverns, theatre. And that's when people start noticing and writing about her. And then in 1611, just before she's arrested for the cross dressing, she's actually the subject of a play. So, Charlie,
Mm.
what play is this?
Well, actually, there's a few plays about Mole. There are two from her lifetime, and there's actually a new one that I only found out about when we were preparing for this podcast, actually, because it only came out last year, and it's called Hear Me Roar by James Bell. And it premiered last year at Grand Valley State University in Michigan. But the first play about Mole's life was actually written in 1610, and it was a drama by John Day called The Mad Pranks of Mary Male of Bankside. But sadly, this text is actually lost, so we don't really know anything much about it aside from, commentary about the play itself at the time. But what we do have is, I think, the play you're referring to, which is 1611's The Roaring Girl
That's
by
the one.
Middleton and Thomas Dekker. Yeah. And it actually inspired the play that came out last year. So I can't comment on the new play, although I'd definitely love to see it. But we do know that both of these plays from 1610 and 11 didn't exactly portray Mole in a very complimentary light. So
Ah,
both centered around her scandalous behavior and her cross dressing. Though, in fairness to the Roaring Girl, it also does show her as being somewhat virtuous and also, surprisingly, you're going to love this, being chaste. And they argue that she's chaste because she's refusing to marry, which I just find is
she's
hilarious. But in The Roaring Girl, they actually do have her attacking a male character for assuming all women to be prostitutes. So I think
nice.
this is pretty progressive for the time that that is included in there. But actually, one of the most extraordinary stories about Mole is that it appears that also in 1611 she actually appeared on stage herself and as herself at the Fortune Theatre where the Roaring Girl was playing.
That's
So dressed
very
in,
something very rare, right? Very, very
yeah,
unusual.
yeah, yeah, unusual and perhaps unprecedented,
Mm.
because women were not actually allowed on stage in England at this time, and yet we have Mole there, dressed in men's clothing, singing songs, playing the lute. She was apparently even engaging in banter with the audience.
Oh, banter.
But yeah, as I say, you didn't have women on stage in the theatres. This isn't until the Merry Monarch, Charles II, is restored to the throne in 1660. And, I'm sure we've all seen enough films about Shakespeare's time to know that the female roles were usually played by, well, were always played by boys or young men in women's clothing. Um, and yet, in Shakespeare, we have all of, this gender switching that is central to the plot in a number of Shakespeare's plays,
Yeah,
which has always had me wondering actually if the players were up to all sorts of tricks and perhaps women were secretly on stage much earlier than we think. But yeah,
interesting.
if nothing else, I think it's quite a clear sort of commentary highlighting both the inequalities of the time as well as perhaps even pointing out the ridiculousness of women not being on the stage themselves. But look, what's really strange about all of this is that there doesn't appear to have been any actual law that banned women from the stage. So even though it is indisputed that women were banned from the stage, there's no law that says that they can't be on stage. So we can only assume that this rule is of a cultural nature, and it also appears to be specifically English because, of course, there's plenty of examples of women elsewhere in Europe performing on stage, especially in Italy. And undoubtedly, the Mary Monarch's time exiled on the continent would have strongly influenced his desire to see women on the stage in England. He may have had other reasons for wanting to see women on the stage in England as well. But in 1662, he actually issues a royal warrant that explicitly states that women, rather than boy actors, are to play all female roles. And yet, this is literally half a century after Mole is said to have made her debut performance at the Fortune Theatre. So I think it's really indicative of how she truly defied conventions of the time. But yeah, in fairness, just because women were not on stage in the theatres, it didn't mean that there were no women performers. So female street
Mm,
performers were rather common, as were rope dancers. Women also performed in court masks, which I know you're going to talk about a bit later. And I just wonder if Mole's appearance at the Fortune Theatre was in itself almost considered to be more on par with like a street performance. Because, if you kind of look up like first woman on stage, it'll bring up either Margaret Hughes or Anne Marshall in December of 1660. And yet it's not like, it's not recorded that Mole wasn't on stage in 1611. There are multiple sources of this. I'm pretty sure that Mole would be fine with not being known as the first woman on stage. I don't think she'd want to be thought of in that way. And I think she was just very much a person who pushed boundaries. And given everything else she got up to, it's not at all surprising that such an impromptu guest performance would be right up her alley. I think
mm.
it's a bit sad though that she died in 1659, so this is when the theaters themselves are still closed thanks to the Puritans. So she dies just before she's able to see women officially take the stage. At the end of the following year.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, like, did she actually want to be an entertainer then? Was that one of her
Mm.
goals? Because maybe this, as you said, was considered a type of street performance or even like a cameo, she's playing herself. So did she just want to entertain? Would she actually have wanted to be an actor? Did she want a career on the stage? Was it just a persona that she used for, notoriety or even for business purposes? It's just so hard to know. And these are all questions that historians just keep asking themselves. And we probably won't be able to answer them anyway, because there's so much sensationalism around her, isn't there? There's so much mythologizing. Whoever the real Mary is, it's just buried beneath all of that. And maybe that's conscious. It could be seen as dehumanizing. Like we're trying to create this image of her at the time as quite a fun one. We're enjoying it as audiences, but at the same time, we're saying she is monstrous. She
Mm.
is an aberration. This is not natural. And I have to emphasize how subversive wearing men's clothing would be for a woman. So we're told that she
Mm.
goes stomping around, wearing breeches, because we might get very excited. And, some people describe Mary as a transgender icon, a lesbian, a trailblazer in, gender fluidity. But even if you wore the wrong sort of hat, you might get into deep trouble. Do you know what I mean? So I'm not saying that Mary wasn't any of those things, but I think we do have to be a bit careful because we don't know. We can't really project, modern framework onto her. That's quite difficult.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. And, you know, there is commentary about how, despite the fact that she dressed in men's clothing, she never actually masqueraded as a man. And, it gets you wondering how much of how Mole presented herself publicly was an attempt to forge a very specific narrative and reputation, perhaps even a survival instinct in order to, ensure her freedom and independence in a time and society that did not easily allow women to have this.
It's like she's too much for them, isn't she? She's too complicated, too nuanced a person. They just can't quite put the finger on who she is. I think the reason that these men embellish so much and they include all of these colorful stories is because they want Moll to be an exception. They want her to be
Mm,
like a freak of nature. Other
yeah,
women should not get ideas that they can do this too. And and we know
definitely
that
not.
they did. We know that they did because there are pamphlets warning men to keep the women in check, keep them away from the trousers, from the breeches, from the hats. So for me, the interesting thing is she didn't have to do any of this, did she? To have some level of independence or even, to support a criminal career if she wanted to. We don't know the relationship between her and her parents. It could have been good, it could have been bad. I mean, just that sort of story with the uncle, even though we don't know if that's completely true or not, that could be a little grain of truth in there, sort of showing that maybe she doesn't have a great relationship with her family. But her father being a
Mm,
shoemaker, maybe he could have taught her the business. So we know there were female apprentices in the 17th century. Wives and daughters could take on the family business. So that was a possibility. There were female fencers and brokers as well. In fact,
mm.
there seem to have actually been quite a lot of them on the
Oh,
criminal
really?
side. Yeah,
Mm,
yeah. When I was looking into it, there are a sort of disproportionate amount of women kind of doing this sort of racket. So the idea that some historians have that she only dressed and behaved this way as a business strategy, for me, it's a bit reductive. I think that erases her queer identity. So whilst
mm,
we might not be able to define her sexual orientation or claim that she was transgender. I think, regardless, her behavior is queer, isn't it? Because she's
yeah.
trying to reject any attempts to be put into this or into that box. And I think that's very relatable to the queer story.
Yeah, 100%. Um, and we know as well, another sort of fun story about her, that in addition to being a fence, she was also a pimp. Um, and
Ah.
more of a pimp than a madam, okay? Which I think is another example of her unconventional behavior of the time. So we know that she procured women for male clients, but she also had an extensive client list of middle class wives for whom she was supplying male sex workers.
What a character. I think, yeah, the last point that I sort of like to make with this is the distinction of class, because you talked about the theatre there and the lack of women
Mm,
in the theatre, except for in a court setting like a
mm,
mask. So masks were very popular under the rule of James the First, and they were very much patronized by his wife, Anne of Denmark. That continued with Charles the First and Henrietta Maria, his wife. So the queens and women of the aristocracy were very influential in these types of performances. And in these performances, the order of things was often subverted. They could be really, quite risque and sexy and um, out there. Women could act in them. Even the queen would maybe
mm,
like design or perform in the mask and star in it. They could take on lots of different roles, ones that would be, considered scandalous or inappropriate. But it's like inside this bubble, it was almost, safe to do so. And other classes, they tend to want to copy the upper classes. But when these kinds of transgressions reach the lower classes, as we've seen before, it creates a problem. And that's also why I think there's so much emphasis on Mary's crimes being of a sexual nature. Like we've
Mm,
discussed, the idea that you said in the play that she's chastising somebody for assuming that all women are prostitutes, actors in particular who are pretty low in the social bar. Then
mm,
you've got street entertainers who are even lower. A female entertainer is just synonymous with a prostitute at the time because it's the worst kind of woman you could possibly be. While we can't state that Mary, perhaps was a trans woman, I think, or a trans man rather, or gender fluid or whatever it may
mm,
be. I think there's an important connection though to the queer and particularly trans community in the story because it's a person who just wants to be who she is, existing outside of these traditional norms of gender and class and decency. And I would say she's erased for it. And some might say, well, how is she erased? We've got loads of stories
mm,
about her plays. We seem to celebrate her. We like her. She's a great character because we don't know who she really was. Because
no,
the image of her is become so distorted, so mythologized. It's like she's been reduced to this legend, almost fictional character. There are even some historians that question whether she really existed
mm.
at all. But regardless, I think she's just such a fascinating character. And sometimes the truth, the real story is just as interesting.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I love her, absolutely love her. So,
If you were to develop a racket like in the 17th
mm,
century, what kind of what sort of criminal do you see yourself being? What would you like to do?
oh, oh, yeah, I don't know, I mean, I'd love to be like a Robin Hood style figure,
Yeah,
robbing
robbing
the
the
rich
rich.
to feed the poor. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I
maybe
think
maybe offensive sorts.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but only you'd only go for like rich
Yeah,
targets.
be
Yeah, you'd
targeted,
only
yeah.
accept. Yeah. I quite see myself as a highwayman. I always fancied myself.
Mm,
I'd love to do that sort of ride up,
adventure.
gallop up, a bit of
Yeah,
adventure, stand and
yeah,
deliver. Maybe, seduce some ladies like,
yeah.
because they used to do a bit of that as well, didn't they? I'd be a sexy highwayman,
You could be
highway
a
person.
spy like Aphra Ben, she was
Oh, yeah.
spying, um,
Yeah.
wasn't she? Yeah. That would be fun.
Yeah, but I
Although
wouldn't be a
she was
spy for the
spying yeah, she
for the
was spying
monarchy.
for yeah, she was spying for the establishment, so I
Yeah.
guess it's not really, yeah, the same thing. Yeah, it could be a double agent of sorts.
Yeah,
That'd be cool.
I think I'd be quite good at that. But anyway,
Mm.
thank you, Charlie. That's all we've got time for.
Thank
It's been great.
you.
It's been
Yeah.
lovely. And please like the podcast, subscribe so you get notification
Share.
for our future episodes. Please share. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time, won't we?
Yeah.
All right.
Bye.
Beautiful. Bye.